The morning began like any other. Sunlight filtered softly through the half-open blinds, casting slender stripes across her bedroom floor, illuminating the scattered notebooks, headphones, and a laptop that had become a constant companion. She moved through her routine with quiet precision, coffee brewed, messages checked, her small rituals of preparation unfolding in a rhythm almost unnoticed by the world. These routines, mundane as they seemed, were an essential part of her life, a framework that allowed her to navigate the demands of school, part-time work, and the sprawling digital networks that had become extensions of herself. Each morning carried a weight she carried lightly, the expectation to perform, to be seen, yet not exposed. Her life existed in this delicate balance between visibility and privacy, a tension that often went unnoticed but was deeply felt. Her school was a conventional place in many ways, but beneath the familiar hum of chatter and locker doors was a subtle hierarchy she had learned to navigate. She moved with awareness, noting the faces that smiled, the ones that judged, the fleeting alliances that shifted from week to week. Her academic record was strong, yet the pressures of maintaining that standard were quiet but persistent. Teachers' expectations lingered like a constant presence, sometimes encouraging, sometimes quietly demanding. In the evenings, she often stayed behind, reviewing notes or completing assignments, headphones on, her mind both present and elsewhere, aware of the world outside but engaged in the meticulous order of her tasks. Beyond the walls of school, her life extended into a digital sphere that was simultaneously expansive and intimate. Social media, chat groups, and personal accounts were arenas of subtle negotiation, spaces where she curated an identity as much as she lived it. Small habits, checking notifications at precise intervals, adjusting privacy settings, deleting old posts, revealed her cautious approach to the digital world. She was aware, perhaps more than many of her peers, that these platforms carried consequences, that each image, video, or message could ripple outward in ways that were both unpredictable and irrevocable. Yet, in the intimacy of her personal devices, she found freedom. Photos of ordinary moments, her dog sleeping in sunlight, a coffee cup beside a half-written essay, were carefully cataloged, preserved for her eyes and those she chose to trust. Her friends, a close-knit group, often saw only fragments of this life. Shared laughter over lunch or during study sessions masked the quieter pressures she carried alone. They knew her as diligent, observant, and thoughtful, but few understood the intricate web of self-monitoring that occupied her time when she was not among them. The tension between her private life and the perception of others was constant but rarely discussed. Even at home, family interactions were layered with expectations and subtle negotiations, reminders about responsibility, cautionary advice, and occasional praise. Within these structures, she carved her space carefully, learning the rhythms of compromise and discretion, aware that both observation and perception were forms of power. It was in these quiet spaces, however, that the seeds of later vulnerability took root. Her laptop, a tool of productivity, also became a repository of personal confidence, self-expression, and creative exploration. Files and folders, images and videos, notes and drafts, these were not just data, they were extensions of thought, emotion, and identity. She organized them meticulously, yet the sheer volume made total control impossible. Small oversights, moments of inattention or hurried actions, clicking the wrong link, sending a file to the wrong folder, assuming a setting was private, were invisible threats that lay in wait. In retrospect, these habits, ordinary in isolation, formed the framework for the incident that would later redefine her world. Her ambitions extended beyond immediate pressures. She dreamed of careers where intelligence and creativity mattered, of spaces where her curiosity could flourish without constant judgment. Whether contemplating technology, psychology, or communications, her interest in understanding systems, both human and digital, was profound. She approached learning with the same meticulous care she applied to her personal life, noting patterns, drawing connections, and imagining consequences. The same traits that allowed her to excel academically and socially also amplified the stakes of missteps. Awareness, once a protective skill, could be a source of heightened anxiety, as each choice carried both opportunity and potential exposure. Evenings were moments of reflective solitude. As the day wound down, she would sit by her window, observing the faint glow of streetlights and the quiet movement of neighbors returning home. In these moments, her thoughts wandered to the balance she maintained between ambition and caution, exposure and privacy, curiosity and discretion. She considered her place in a world that increasingly demanded visibility, where personal moments could be amplified beyond comprehension. The tranquility of these hours was deceptive. It masked the latent fragility of her constructed environment. Her mind, ever analytical, recognized the delicate tension between control and chance, between intentional action and unforeseen consequence. Within the architecture of her digital life, she also cultivated a space of experimentation. Videos, private recordings, notes, and personal reflections were created with care, often never intended for anyone else. These were exercises in self-expression, small explorations of identity and confidence, places to test boundaries safely. Yet in the same way that calm seas can conceal hidden currents, these digital archives were vulnerable. Their existence was a quiet acknowledgement of trust, of security, assumed rather than guaranteed. The complexity of managing privacy alongside creativity created a subtle undercurrent of anxiety, one that she largely carried alone, invisible to those around her. By the end of the chapter, the audience has been fully grounded in her world, the routines, the ambitions, the careful cultivation of identity, both in person and online. The stakes of her life, while not yet apparent in crisis, are embedded in the narrative, the pressure to perform, the balancing act of perception, and the latent vulnerability of a digital footprint that intertwines with personal identity. This foundation is essential, establishing both empathy and understanding, setting the stage for the events that will unfold. The chapter closes on a reflective note, with her gaze returning to the quiet streets outside, a sense of calm tempered by the subtle awareness that even the smallest moments can carry unforeseen consequences, and that the boundaries she relies upon are never absolute. The moment itself was deceptively quiet, a single misclick that would ripple far beyond its origin. In the calm of her room, the video, intended for private storage, was inadvertently shared across a small, online platform. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a brief notification, a subtle change in the digital landscape she had carefully curated. But the imperceptible shift quickly became an unmistakable tremor. The file had escaped the controlled environment she trusted, moving into a space she could not immediately monitor. The awareness of that loss of control sparked a sudden tension, a tightening in the chest, as if the air had thickened and refused to circulate freely. Every thought turned inward, analyzing how a single moment could undo weeks or months of careful management. Reactions were swift, though scattered at first. Close friends, those she considered confidants, noticed changes in tone across messages and comments. Some approached cautiously, offering reassurances while probing for details, their concern a mix of empathy and curiosity. Others, equally well-intentioned, unwittingly amplified the reach, forwarding links or sharing screenshots. The delicate network of trust she had cultivated in her immediate social circle began to fracture under the weight of exposure. Each interaction, however small, carried new stakes. A message that had once been trivial now hinted at judgment, embarrassment, or even betrayal. Within her family, the shift was subtler but no less significant. Parents observed her distracted glances, the tension in her posture, the quiet withdrawal from habitual conversations. Their questions were measured, concerned, tinged with the instinctive desire to protect, while also respecting boundaries. Even in this familiar space, the sense of exposure created an emotional friction. Privacy, once assumed, had become provisional, contingent on the perceptions of others. The household, normally a refuge, now carried echoes of a world that was simultaneously intimate and unforgiving. The wider online community responded in ways she could neither anticipate nor contain. Initial comments ranged from neutral to bemused, quickly escalating into waves of attention that her algorithms could not fully track. Notifications multiplied with alarming speed, a cascade of alerts that seemed to demand immediate engagement even as it paralyzed her with indecision. Each new share or mention felt like a small avalanche, cumulative in effect, shaping the perception of an audience that was vast and faceless. The platform itself, once a tool of expression and social connection, had become a conduit for anxiety, amplifying both the visibility of her private moments and the intensity of her emotional response. The psychological impact of exposure was immediate and complex. Confusion dominated the first reactions, a disorienting swirl of how and why that blurred temporal and spatial awareness. Fear followed closely, not only of judgment but of consequences she could not fully predict. She questioned the intentions of those who had interacted with the content, imagining scenarios of ridicule, shaming, or misinterpretation. Each thought spiraled into the next, forming an internal landscape of pressure that expanded faster than any external event. The attempt to regain control became urgent, yet each intervention, attempts to delete, restrict, or clarify, revealed the limitations of agency in a digital ecosystem she could not fully command. Amid this turbulence, attempts to understand and contextualize the situation were constant. She traced timelines, reviewed access logs, and retraced every interaction that could have led to the leak. Analytical skills, once applied to academics or hobbies, were now turned inward, dissecting cause and effect with meticulous intensity. This investigative approach provided a measure of comfort, a sense that understanding could mitigate chaos, yet also amplified awareness of vulnerability. Every potential misstep, every overlooked setting, became a point of emotional friction. The mind that had thrived on structure and observation now ran along the perimeter of unpredictability, calculating probabilities, imagining worst-case scenarios, and confronting the consequences of inadvertent exposure. Social consequences unfolded in parallel with emotional ones. Peers who had once engaged casually now reacted with hesitation, amusement, or subtle judgment. The network she had relied on for collaboration, friendship, and support now carried new social weight. Encounters at school, casual interactions in hallways, or group work sessions were reframed by the lingering presence of digital exposure. Observers interpreted her actions through a lens colored by online events, subtly shifting the dynamic of relationships she had assumed were stable. Even neutral parties became vectors of perception, contributing to a climate of scrutiny that magnified the intensity of every social gesture. The emotional terrain extended beyond immediate circles. A sense of vulnerability permeated the private spaces she occupied, the room, the bed, the quiet corners of her home. Sleep became fitful, each notification a potential threat to calm. Concentration on tasks was punctuated by recurring mental checks, the persistent need to survey, monitor, and evaluate. Fear, confusion, and regret coexisted uneasily with fleeting attempts at rationalization or normalization. The mind alternated between hyper-awareness and fatigue, the oscillation creating a unique tension that was both exhausting and compelling in its immediacy. Attempts to regain equilibrium were deliberate. She revisited her digital habits, reviewing security measures, privacy settings, and the logic of sharing across platforms. Small victories, a successfully restricted post, the removal of a forwarded link, provided temporary relief, a sense of reasserting agency in a landscape where control had been compromised. These actions were paired with reflective moments, considering how her habits, trust, and assumptions had converged to create the conditions for exposure. Each measure of control reinforced the lesson that digital life, while expansive and liberating, carried risks proportional to opportunity. By the end of the chapter, the immediate crisis had begun to stabilize, yet the consequences remained tangible. The ripple effects of the leak, both social and psychological, set the stage for longer-term impact. She had confronted the fragility of privacy, the intensity of social judgment, and the complexity of digital networks. Emotional responses, though still acute, were accompanied by nascent strategies for adaptation and understanding. The narrative concluded on a reflective note, emphasizing the inevitability of learning from exposure, the gradual recovery of control, and the importance of measured responses in the face of unforeseen consequences. The chapter transitioned naturally into considerations of resilience, adaptation, and the broader implications that would occupy the next stage of her experience, preparing the audience to follow her journey with both empathy and investigative clarity. In the days following the leak, her life settled into a new rhythm, one defined by cautious reflection and deliberate action. The immediacy of panic had given way to a slower, more deliberate assessment of the damage, both tangible and psychological. She began by reviewing every facet of her digital presence, tracing the pathways through which the video had spread. Notifications, comments, and forwarded links were cataloged and considered, each a small clue in understanding the broader landscape of exposure. What initially seemed chaotic began to reveal patterns, subtle threads connecting her network of friends, acquaintances, and strangers who had interacted with the material. The analytical mind that had guided her through schoolwork and personal projects now became a tool for understanding vulnerability, responsibility, and consequence. Repairing trust was a painstaking process. Friends who had been caught in the first waves of the leak approached her with varying degrees of concern, skepticism, or curiosity. She engaged with them deliberately, clarifying misunderstandings where necessary, acknowledging mistakes where appropriate, and emphasizing the importance of discretion moving forward. Each conversation was measured, neither defensive nor performative, but rooted in a desire to restore equilibrium. Family interactions followed a similar trajectory. Parents, once anxious observers, began to see evidence of her reflection and adaptation, recognizing that the lessons learned were internalized rather than merely imposed externally. The household, which had briefly felt like a space of surveillance, gradually returned to a place of shared understanding and cautious reassurance. Her engagement with the wider social landscape was equally methodical. She observed the conversations unfolding online, noting shifts in tone, the emergence of supportive voices, and the persistence of those who reveled in judgment. Rather than responding impulsively, she maintained a measured presence, using privacy settings, reporting mechanisms, and carefully timed clarifications to regain a sense of agency. Each action was deliberate, informed by prior reflection and an understanding of the mechanics of digital attention. The broader audience, faceless and unpredictable, became a mirror of the stakes inherent in public exposure, reputation, perception, and the delicate balance of control in spaces that are simultaneously intimate and infinitely expansive. Emotionally, the aftermath demanded both endurance and introspection. She confronted lingering feelings of fear, embarrassment, and betrayal, acknowledging that these emotions were natural responses to a breach of trust and privacy. At the same time, moments of relief and empowerment emerged, particularly when she realized the extent to which she could influence her environment through thoughtful action. Reflection became a tool for resilience, allowing her to interpret the experience not merely as a crisis, but as a lesson in adaptability, foresight, and emotional intelligence. This mental processing was not linear. Fear and confidence coexisted, sometimes in the same moments, creating a nuanced emotional landscape that required careful navigation. The leak also prompted deeper contemplation of the nature of digital life. She considered the mechanisms that had enabled exposure, the assumptions she had held about privacy, and the responsibilities inherent in sharing personal content. These reflections extended beyond immediate consequences, touching on broader questions of accountability, consent, and the permanence of online actions. In understanding these dynamics, she began to reconstruct her habits, adjusting privacy measures, rethinking communication patterns, and developing routines that balanced openness with discretion. The process was iterative, reflective of a growing awareness that digital literacy is as much about emotional preparation as technical competence. Unexpected opportunities began to emerge alongside challenges. The incident, while initially traumatic, had inadvertently illuminated her capacity for problem-solving, comanalysis, and strategic communication. Observers noted her measured responses, friends appreciated her transparency, and even distant acquaintances recognized the deliberate care with which she managed her digital identity. These outcomes, subtle yet meaningful, revealed that crises could serve as catalysts for growth, highlighting latent strengths that had previously been untested. The narrative of vulnerability transformed into a story of agency, demonstrating how a careful balance of reflection and action could convert exposure into empowerment. Daily life, once punctuated by sudden spikes of anxiety, regained a sense of rhythm. School, work, and social interactions resumed with a tempered awareness, guided by the lessons learned from exposure. Her internal dialogue, previously dominated by confusion and fear, shifted toward evaluation, anticipation, and problem-solving. She developed strategies to mitigate risk without sacrificing authenticity, embracing the complexity of her position rather than seeking illusory simplicity. Each moment became an exercise in deliberate action, where choices were informed by prior experience and tempered by an understanding of human and technological behavior. The chapter also explores the subtle psychological evolution that occurred during this period. Awareness of vulnerability coexisted with growing confidence in her ability to manage consequences. She began to observe herself more deliberately, analyzing emotional triggers, thought patterns, and behavioral tendencies. Reflection was paired with mindfulness, allowing her to navigate moments of residual